This is a video primarily discussing monorails, so I'll give you a moment to get all the Simpsons references off your chest. Okay, done that? Then we will begin. I've talked about monorails a few times on this channel, but it's usually in the context of, well, failure. It's generally a scheme that didn't go ahead or went ahead but wasn't a success. The problem with monorails, despite the implication of this video's title, is not that they don't work, but that most of the schemes that get publicity don't work as well as something else would. Here in the UK, we have an extensive rail infrastructure already in place, so that tends to mean that it's either desirable to build railways compatible with the existing network, or it's just simpler to go with what you know. Where monorails have been successfully used, it's tended to be in a leisure context where the novelty is part of the appeal. Or at least, so far as the public are concerned. But that's only half the story. The real story is a little more complicated. Now, I recently received an email from the Amberley Museum in West Sussex asking if I'd be interested in paying them a visit. Well, as it happens, they have an example of a monorail that proves my point here, so I thought that was rather serendipitous. The monorail was built by Road Machines Limited and invented by William Muir Robb. These were made from 1949 onwards for use in construction. Back when road vehicles were less able to cope with rough terrain, there used to be these things known as contractors' railways. These were temporary railways, often narrow gauge, run with lightweight rolling stock. You'd lay the track down, use the train to transport whatever needed transporting, then take the track up when you were done. These monorails were a variation on that. They consisted of a single rail about 9 inches or 23 centimetres off the ground. The rails were supported on legs, which could be adjusted to take account of variations in ground level. So it didn't have to be 9 inches or 23 centimetres. That being said, it wasn't unknown for the trains to stall on bumps in the track. The lengths of track were bolted together on site. There were different lengths of rail too, so say you had a ditch or a particularly nasty dip, your line could simply run over the top of it without fuss. They even made points for the system, although you can't see any of those here. There were 2 basic types of rolling stock, power cars and trailers. The power car was a tipper wagon with a 4-stroke petrol engine attached. The trailers were, well, just a tipper wagon. Early versions of the power cars had mechanical transmission, later ones were hydraulic. The mechanical wagon is propelled by a single wheel below the engine, the hydraulic one by a wheel at each end. There are more wheels for stability either side of the rail. You may have noticed that there's no driver's seat. That's because these things ran on their own. They moved at slightly slower than walking pace, and being on a rail, there's no need to worry about them going adrift. You were more likely to trip over the rail than get hit by one. Road Machines produced a device that could bring the machine to an automatic stop, by which I mean a metal peg that hit the stop lever as the train went past. They were even simpler and more lightweight than a typical contractor's railway, and much more forgiving of rough ground. Obviously they took up less space, so they could be used in places where even a narrow gauge railway would be too wide. They were primarily designed for building sites, but being so simple, they were highly customizable. Owners might rebuild the wagon body for other kinds of work, for instance, fitting a flatbed or bolsters. Some lines were even installed permanently. The most unconventional use for one has to be in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice, where it was the villain's preferred mode of transport around his evil lair. Put a pin in that, I'll be coming back to Bond villains later. In some ways, the concept behind the Road Machines monorail was a pretty old one. Charles Lartigue came up with a similar concept in the 19th century for use in deserts where the shifting sands could bury conventional railway track. His monorails were usually steam-powered though, and the problem was keeping them balanced. They never caught on. The most famous example was the Listowel and Ballybunion Railway in County Kerry in Ireland, which is about as undesert-like as you can get without being underwater. It was not the optimum means of transport for that place. The development of internal combustion engines allowed road machines of West Drayton to make their vehicles much lighter and less cumbersome, and overall easier to balance. You might be wondering why a monorail company would call themselves road machines. Well, they manufactured many kinds of construction equipment. The monorails were just the surprising hit in their catalogue. These systems were manufactured until 1967, by which time there was something in the region of 800 systems in use all over the world. Improvements in construction machinery, such as dump trucks, rendered them largely obsolete. Road machines also made dump trucks, so I guess they weren't too bothered either way. But there were still those who considered the monorails useful. The Metal Air Company made their own variant until 1983, and later so did Alan Keefe. There are still builders of useful little monorails to this day, and plenty of them in use. The technology has improved, but the concept is little changed. Several road machines' monorail vehicles survive. Here at Amberley they have a rare working example. Elsewhere, one enthusiast, Rich Morris, converted some wagons into passenger coaches, and even built a steam-powered locomotive. Lartigue would be proud. I always think industrial monorails are the unsung heroes of the monorail world. The monorail may rarely be the optimal solution for passenger transport, but there are lots of circumstances to which they're still ideally suited. They just aren't very glamorous, so they don't get much attention. As I say, this example is preserved at Amberley and is a delightful little thing. You couldn't call it pretty, but it's still an important survivor. The Amberley Museum is a great place to visit if you're interested in this kind of thing. They have plenty of examples of railway equipment, not just monorails. They have plenty of construction equipment, for that matter, and lots of other exhibits on lots of different subjects. It's basically several museums in one, so it really is a full day out. If you're a train nut, it's a must-see, with an enormous variety of stock on show. This engine, currently in pieces, is their flagship engine, Polar Bear. Here's one of the old Post Office Underground trains. Can you call it a train when it's only one vehicle? I guess technically it's a kind of rail car. Now, have we heard enough about monorails for the time being? I'm going to assume you just said yes there, because now I want to get really self-indulgent. Remember I mentioned Bond villains earlier? Last time I was here I talked about the fact that this museum was used in A View to a Kill as Max Zorin's main strike mine. A View to a Kill has its detractors, but my counterpoint is Grace Jones, Christopher Walken, and A Fight in a Zeppelin, which objectively puts it in the top 10 best movies ever made. I mean, Citizen Kane never had a fight in an airship. Just putting that out there. Amberley Museum still has several wagons in the Zorin organisation's green livery, and it also has the 2 identical locomotives used in the film. This engine is a Hudson Hunslet named Blue Star. It used to be painted blue, you see. Actually, it was owned by Star Construction and was another contractor's loco, so that's another happy coincidence for you. Anyway, they let me actually drive it over the very same track used in the film. Maybe it's a sign of some latent supervillainy within me, but this was the absolute highlight of my day. I'm never going to own an Aston Martin, but as far as I'm concerned, this is even better. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Much of the information here came from the Industrial Railway Society, as well as the good people at Amberley. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the petrol engine to my tipper wagon. I would also like to thank the staff at the Amberley Museum for inviting me over and showing me around. They were incredibly helpful and informative, and I strongly recommend paying them a visit. The museum is in West Sussex, really easy to reach by public transport. The entrance is in fact right next to Amberley Station. If you can't make it, well, I'm sure this is far from the last time I'll be using footage from the museum. So, having said all that remains is for me to say that I hope to see you again very soon. Cheerio.